Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. In the interest of keeping to a schedule, we'll go ahead and begin our second panel. My name is Fred Axelgaard, and I've been asked to chair this second panel. We'll have basically the same format. I'll give a brief introduction. We'll have three speakers, each of whom will speak about 15 minutes, and we'll open the floor to questions for about half an hour. At the end of that, there'll be a brief period of summarizing or taking the implications of the two panels and a wrap-up session, and we hope to be done by right about 5 p.m. The purpose of the second panel is to provide perspectives on the subject of Islam and the West by individuals from the West. Each has long experience interacting with Islam and Muslims from around the world. The depth of their experience and the insights they have to offer will soon become evident. You can anticipate a unique and uniquely enlightening experience here today. Professor Samuel Huntington, writing in 1993, framed the question before this symposium: can conflict between Islam and the West be avoided? He was not optimistic. He predicted that a pattern of civilizational conflict would prevail in the coming phase of international politics. A lengthy debate has ensued in the intervening years. A great deal has been said and written, but a consensus seems as far away as ever. In fact, exaggerated fears, misperception, and misunderstanding continue. Hence the importance of our meeting here today. Our meeting today, though, is not only important, it is timely. Recent events in the Middle East mark a milestone unlike any we have seen for decades. I don't believe anyone can fully explain why things have happened or even what is going on, let alone predict what the results will be or when they might occur. But something basic has changed. People in one part of the Arab world after another have shown they want a say in their future. This, after long decades of living in the shadows of oppressive governments. But it does seem safe to conclude that life in the Middle East will never be the same, even if we must wait to see just how that change will materialize. I think it's also worth considering whether these events will change the way the West looks at Islam in a fundamental way. Islamic countries are having their own popular and democratic revolutions. And despite all the unpredictability that this entails, I would not be surprised if many in the West, especially young people, haven't already begun to admire and even identify with what is going on among their Arab counterparts. So where does this leave you as a BYU audience? Should a BYU audience see itself as part of the West in this equation of Islam versus the West? On one hand, BYU is the embodiment of a worldwide church with members in countries like Jordan, India, and Indonesia. And as you listen, ask yourself, what would a Jordanian, an Indian, or an Indonesian Latter-day Saint think about what is being said? On the other hand, as a latter-day revelation of the Christian faith, there are many doctrinal and historical dimensions of the confrontation between Islam and the West that we, as Mormons, don't participate in and don't identify with. One might say we occupy, in a sense, a third position, one that I think is still being fleshed out as Mormonism encounters the many facets of Islam across the world. By being here today, you are helping and participating in shaping this interface. We have three people with unique experiences and backgrounds with us today, and I'll take a minute to introduce them. It won't do justice to any of them, but I'm pleased to say I've known each one of them for some period of time. The first panelist to speak to us today will be Major General Retired Buford Blunt. General Blunt and I were together in Saudi Arabia for 4 years while I worked at the U.S. Embassy there. General Blunt was the advisor to the Saudi Arabian National Guard, which meant that for 4 years, on a weekly basis, he consulted on security and other issues with the man who is currently the King of Saudi Arabia. And I thought inviting Buff to this symposium would bring a very unique perspective. After he left his position in Saudi Arabia, General Blunt became the commanding general of the 3rd Infantry Division. This meant that he led the 3rd Infantry into Iraq during the invasion in 2003 and was the architect of a tremendously effective military maneuver. I'll put it that way. More fascinating to me, though, are the events that followed when he and the 3rd Infantry Division took up responsibility for interfacing directly with Iraqis in carrying out the difficult job of now rebuilding security and other structures in the country. Buff retired from the U.S. Army in the year 2005. He was on the staff of the Army staff in the Pentagon and retired as the G3, correct? Responsibility for both budget and training and other matters for the entire Army. I feel we're very fortunate to have him here with us today. Professor Donna Lee Bowen is also going to be speaking to us. And I'm going to read a little bit more carefully from Donna Lee's bio than I did from General Blunt's. Professor Bowen is Professor of Political Science and Middle East Studies here at BYU. She teaches courses in comparative politics, Middle East area studies, and gender politics. She's written extensively, and she writes on the intersection of religion, tradition, and politics in the Middle East. She's authored articles and a forthcoming book on attempts to construct policy which reflects Muslim sensibilities, specifically social policy concerning family planning and abortion. Her edited book, Everyday Life in the Muslim Middle East, is widely used in universities. She has traveled and lived in North Africa and the Middle East and has held 2 Fulbright grants, as well as funding from the Ford Foundation, National Institute of Mental Health, and the David M. Kennedy Center. She's served on a number of administrative capacities, both at BYU and in Middle East Studies organizations across the country. She's also worked in a consulting status for the World Bank, the Ford Foundation, USAID. The third person on the panel today is, again, a friend of long-standing and somebody that is probably not unknown to most of you. Professor Dan Peterson is a professor of Islamic Studies in Arabic here at BYU. As a professor of Arabic, he currently serves as editor-in-chief and director of the Middle East Texts Initiative. I wonder if anybody understands exactly what that is or the full implications, Dan. If I could sum it up briefly, Dan undertook some years back to begin a series of side-by-side English-Arabic translations of medieval philosophical texts. And the way I took it was a one-man's extraordinary and creative effort to build bridges by establishing commonalities or opening the door to discover commonalities in thought philosophically between the West and Islam. It's a very unique enterprise, and again, as I've said before, hats off to you, Dan, for that. Dr. Peterson received his PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in 1990, and his bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University. He received a bachelor's degree in Greek and philosophy, and after several years' study in Jerusalem and Cairo, earned his PhD. He's known for his work as an apologist and scholar on subjects dealing with the claims of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of which he's a member. He's also an editor of the Farms Review, a periodical produced by the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. I've also been fortunate to participate in some of his online activities. Tremendously energetic and talented individual. I'll now turn the time over to General Blunt and ask him to take the podium for about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Fred. Well, I'm going to hopefully get technology working here. It's going to take a minute to power back up, probably. It's great to be here. My first time at BYU, hopefully not the last. Would like to thank the Wheatley Institute for hosting this. It's a very timely, I think very important conference, especially in light of all the changes, all the turmoil that are going on in the Middle East today. It's so important that we all understand better, what is happening. I think this thing went to sleep completely, which I might do if I don't get some caffeine in me pretty soon. I'm going through caffeine withdrawal now. Growing up in the military, that's something that, in the Pentagon, it was not unusual to have, 8, 9, 10 cups of coffee during the day to get through the day. I'm going to need an administrator to do a password here probably. but I guess he has left, so I'll wing it here until he comes back in. But no, I did have the pleasure of working very closely with King Abdullah, and you know our previous panel talked about the things that the Muslim world admired about the United States, and in addition to the technology, and King Abdullah was not necessarily impressed with our democracy and how we wanted to export that to the rest of the world at that time under President Bush and some of his verbiage. But he was very impressed with our management skills, and that's throughout all of my time in the Middle East. Management has been a key skill that the Americans seem to do better than anyone else. And the other thing that he brought up continually was that we were not a colonial power. We had never colonized anybody, and that was very important to him. He talked about the Saudi history and how they had the Turks and all the different countries coming into the Arab world, and they were all interested in colonialism. And he was very impressed with the United States never having been a colonial power. Now, we get accused of that on a daily basis a lot of times, and especially when there's oil involved, but he really thought that was one of our stronger points. But understanding Islam and understanding the West, and whether you sort out what the West is or not, but everyone's got their own world, and they were talking about Mississippi a minute ago, a town in Mississippi. Well, in Mississippi, only people we can talk about are the people in Lower Alabama. We call them L.A., Lower Alabama. And John was working in a Walmart store. This was in 2008, now the fall of 2008. And, it's not deer season yet, but he had a lot of people coming in buying ammunition. And he was almost to the point where he was sold out of ammunition. And so he asked one of the guys standing in line, said, "What do you need all this ammunition for?" And he said, "Well, haven't you been watching the news?" And he said, "No, I've been here working at the store." He said, "Well, Russia's invaded Georgia, and by God, we're not going to let them take Alabama." Okay. So, but we all have our little piece of the world. Now, most people in Lower Alabama have never left Lower Alabama. They spend their, they're born there, grow up there, married, have their kids, and die there. So it's a different world, and understanding what's outside your world is so important. I grew up moving. I grew up in the military. I moved 35 times in my life, and spent about 10 years in the Middle East. Can we kill two of the lights there? But I've got to become very good friends with a lot of people in the Middle East, and I've been from all the way from Morocco to Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, all the Arab countries. My time in Saudi, I've got, in fact, actually, I've lived longer in Saudi Arabia than anywhere else, in my life. So I know a lot of Saudis. Spent a lot of time discussing religion with them and politics, and it we always came down to the Palestinian Israel issue. But the thing with the King Abdullah is I have a tremendous amount of confidence in him. He has really done a turnaround in the kingdom. Is looking at modernization. He has his own, instilling his own form of democracy, but he's a great man, and I think as long as he's in power there, as long as he lives long enough, that the kingdom will continue to prosper and change, and move towards a much more modern state. This is his son, Prince Mitab, the possible heir to the throne one day. This is after 9/11. King Abdullah sent him out to talk to the Americans, to express their extreme condolences and concerns about what happened with 9/11, and make sure that we felt secure and welcome in the kingdom there. Now, at this point, they were still in denial that there were any Saudis involved. This is probably probably 15th or 16th of September. But they were still, just absolutely no way could a Saudi have been involved in that, was their position. And so it was, they've since overcome those those beliefs, but they were, they had all the other theories that were out there as to, what happened there. But the Saudis were very, very supportive of us there in the kingdom, and I really wanted to make sure that they understood how concerned the leadership was about 9/11. Now, that did not apply to all Saudis. There were a lot of Saudis that felt that we deserved it, that we were too arrogant, and this was bringing us down a notch. And so there were a lot of people in Saudi that believed that we deserve that. As Fred said, after leaving the kingdom, I got selected to command the 3rd Infantry Division. The 3rd Infantry Division is stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia, where there are a lot of pine trees, not much sand-colored, but our focus of the division was in the Middle East. And so we trained to deploy to the Middle East into several different countries, several different scenarios from Fort Stewart. All our vehicles were sand-colored painted. We wore sand-colored uniforms, and had our linguists and intelligence personnel were all focused on the Middle East. And so each of the Army's divisions has a different area to focus in. Of course, they had a lot in Germany that were focused on the Cold War, and they had Russian linguists and Russian intelligence people. But our focus for the 3rd Infantry Division was the Middle East. In the middle of 2002, we were moving to Kuwait in anticipation. We were actually doing a training exercise, but it also was anticipation for potential buildup for an invasion. And so we got to spend about 9 months in the Kuwaiti desert getting ready for the event. Now, we'd been to Kuwait many times. That's one of, about every other year we would deploy an element to Kuwait to train in the desert. And another understanding issue, and it goes both ways. The very first time I was in Kuwait was over the Thanksgiving holiday period occurred there. And, the Prince, we were there really as a defense mechanism for the Kuwaiti government there, and in case Saddam decided to attack again. And so they were very appreciative of our presence there. And so the Prince sent his chief of staff out to talk to me and said, I understand Thanksgiving's coming up. What can we do for you? And he said the Prince really wants to make sure you're felt welcome and taken care of. And we would like to host a meal for you on Thanksgiving. And I said, he understood that, Thanksgiving was a big day for us. And in the military, it is a big event in the dining facility. We prepare big turkeys, and all the troops come through, and the mess hall's dining facility is all well decorated, and have a big Thanksgiving celebration with turkeys being the key part of that. So I said, yes, it would be very nice if you could cater a meal out for us. And so that morning, Thanksgiving morning, we get up and do our physical training, of course, and about 10 o'clock, the big truck comes up, catering the meal for us. And I look at it, and it's Mohammed's Turkish Restaurant. Okay. And they started offloading sheep, and not one turkey to be found. But they knew turkeys were important to us, and so Turkish Restaurant was out catering our meal for us. So we had some great lamb and baba ganoush and tabbouleh and things, but not the traditional Thanksgiving meal. But understanding it is just so important. But while we were there in Kuwait, we got to spend a lot of time, like I said, training. And one of my focuses, having spent a lot of years in the Middle East, was to make sure that our soldiers understood more about the culture in Iraq. Of course, we knew we had to understand our enemy, but we also wanted them to understand the people that we were going in there to liberate, and what their customs and cultures were going to be like. And the more that our soldiers understood, I think the better the operation was going to be. As the chart shows, I had over 25,000 soldiers under my command, moving with me with a lot of vehicles, and we carried a lot of stuff with us. But our focus was not to destroy the the Iraqi infrastructure or their culture. It was to go in and get rid of the Ba'athist Party, get rid of Saddam's leadership there, and set the conditions for a new Iraqi government to take over. Of course, we had our own religious ceremonies in the desert before we attacked, and also had a lot of media with us. We knew this would be a televised war, and so we thought we would try to control it as best we could, and so we invited, I had 85 media teams with me, in my division. Ted Koppel was mentioned earlier today, but he spent about 3 months with us there in the desert, and then rode with us throughout the operation. Some of them came in and spent a couple of days with us and left. Some stayed, but we had 85 teams that actually crossed the border with us when we went on the attack. And realizing that everything was subject to being filmed, and I told them there was no censorship. You can report what happens. I put a few restraints. They couldn't show where we were going to go the next day, and I preferred really they didn't show where we were that day, but they really could film and report anything else they wanted to. And so we had a very live coverage of our operations. Now this is a sign. One of the advantages of having all the reporters with us, we got a lot of good pictures. This is one after we had crossed the Euphrates River, getting ready to go into Baghdad on our final assault. And this picture was taken, and it was about 2 years later. I was putting a briefing together and saw this sign. And to the left is Fallujah, which I'd never heard of, didn't mean anything to me. And then you also had Abu Ghraib, which was another place I'd never heard of, but would become very famous, in a few months after this picture was taken. And of course, Baghdad, which was the focus of our attack. Our mission was not to seize the whole country. Really, it was to get to Baghdad and destabilize the regime. It was the initial mission that we started on. We went to great efforts to protect the infrastructure, to protect the mosque. We identified every mosque in our area of assault that we were going on. So every mosque in Baghdad, all the way from Basra, Samoa, Karbala, every mosque was identified and plotted on a map, plotted and put it in the computers, and no fire zones put around all the mosques, all the schools, hospitals, key buildings like that. And I think very successfully. We had no incidents with the mosque the first couple of months. We did have problems with hospitals and schools because Saddam had fortified a lot of the schools, had stockpiled ammunition and weapons in probably 20 to 25% of the schools. They put artillery pieces outside schoolyards and to shoot at us. They occupied a lot of the hospitals. A lot of the hospitals had closed, and so the soldiers would come in and shoot at us from the windows. But overall, it was a very, very effective campaign. Here I'm briefing the final attack plan to go to Baghdad. I've got all my commanders together and re-emphasizing we also had a rule of no unobserved fires, so that in the past we would shoot artillery. If you're going to go into an area, you just shoot artillery in that area just to suppress the enemy. But we said no unobserved fires. You must see an enemy that you can shoot at, and we were not going to just randomly shoot artillery into the Baghdad area. So I'm briefing all of my commanders there, re-emphasizing the importance of minimalizing the collateral damage, the casualties, because we also knew we were going to have to rebuild Iraq after we finished, destabilizing the Ba'athist regime there. Our quickest way home was to be able to turn things back over to them, so we were very concerned about, not destroying the electrical grid, water, sewer systems, things like that. So a lot of effort was put into protecting those systems. This was our attack plan. The red are the bad guys, and the yellow star burst are where we actually had battles there in about a 24-hour period as we seized the airport in Baghdad there. Up in the upper left-hand corner is Abu Ghraib, and then a little further out to the left is Fallujah. Now, Fred asked me to talk a little bit about Fallujah. After we seized Baghdad, I was basically the mayor of Baghdad for about 3 months till Bremer came in and then took charge. My division was replaced in Baghdad, and so we had, like I said, sent about a third of them back to Kuwait. The other 2/3, we were asked to go out to Fallujah, which was a town that was very Ba'athist-oriented, had not had much fighting at all in it, and but the 82nd had been out there and had a lot of problems. They'd had 2 or 3 fights, and there'd been 15 to 16 people killed in one incident, and most of them innocent, but the shooting started, and there were a lot of civilian casualties involved there. So we went out and took over Fallujah, and a lot of you have heard about Fallujah. It became a great nest of for the insurgency a couple of years later. But during this time period, we engaged with the city leadership, was still in, all the infrastructure was in place there. Nothing had been destroyed. So we engaged with the mayor, the police chief, they had a school board. We met with the school board, met with the hospitals, and did everything that we could to help get the city back on its feet and to basically win the hearts and minds. But because of the fighting that had already happened there was a lot of resentment against the Americans. And so the imams in the mosque were preaching against us. There were about 26 mosques in Fallujah, and they were all preaching anti-American rhetoric. We would run patrols and get shot at from certain areas, and so I really didn't want to come in with a heavy fist because we were there to win the hearts and minds, and you don't do it with a heavy fist if you can help it. So I met with the mayor, and we talked about, we've got to stop the fighting. We've got to stop the people from these neighborhoods shooting at us, or we're going to have to go in and counterattack. So we talked about blood money, and he said, well, really they're shooting at you because 2 brothers were killed by the previous unit there, and the deaths had never been recognized, and they hadn't paid. They'd investigated them, but they never. And that's one of American military's problems is we conduct investigations on problems, but a lot of times we don't give feedback to the people that were wronged. We conduct the investigation, may conduct punishment, but don't actually tell the people what happened. So no feedback had been given to these families that had people killed. And so they were, by their culture, they had to attack us. And they were going to shoot at us till they killed an American. And so I said, okay, let's pay the blood money. I sent a representative. We acknowledged the deaths, and everything was fine. They quit shooting at us. But because knowing the culture and being able to communicate with them and not shutting them off, but understanding, we were able to avoid a lot of conflicts. Another time we were hot on Saddam's trail. He was supposed to be in Fallujah, and so we were surrounded this city block, and we're looking for him there. About 2 blocks away, a white truck pulled up, and 4 guys jumped out with what appeared to be weapons in their hands, and so this American soldier on the corner shot and ended up killing a 7-year-old boy in the truck. And the men had been out cutting wood because they didn't have propane, so all the propane had been shut down, and so all the wives were all upset because they couldn't cook, and so men had to go get wood. But they had wood in their hands and axes, and so the soldier thought there were weapons and fired. But that's a case where we were wrong. So we quickly conducted the investigation. I told the commander, you go meet with the family and the local sheik and express your condolences, pay compensation, buy them a new truck, and smooth things over. And so he did that, and he had been in the Middle East before, had a good background, so he understood what needed to be done. He understood. And so about 3 days later, my officer came and said the sheikh wanted to talk to me, and he said, General, before this incident I was against you. I was against the Americans being here. But you showed understanding. Your people came and met with us and explained what happened and did the right thing. You understood our culture, and so I think I'll support you. And turned it around in his neighborhood. We met with the imams and tried to, because they were still preaching against us, and so we got the imams to meet with us. About 15 of them refused to, but we did meet with about half of them. And their biggest thing was, one of the big issues was propane. The women couldn't cook, and they couldn't prepare their tea and things like that. So we arranged to bring up a truckload of propane from Kuwait City, and I gave it to the imams to distribute to the people. And so it made them look good Now we had U.S. stamps on most of the bottles, U.S. flags, but and then we started providing foods and things through the imams. And within about 2 weeks, we had 20 of the imams supporting us, and 4 still refused to talk to us and to distribute the goods to their people. But then their people started resenting that also, because they knew their neighbors were getting propane from their, imam down the street, but their imam wasn't giving them anything. So, but by working the culture, understanding it, and trying to develop dialogues and talk and listen, we had a pretty successful operation there in Fallujah. So, in about a 2 to 3 month period, it went from a problem to probably one of the best solutions in Iraq at that time. And so we were pulled out, and we came on back to the States. And then they put another unit back in there that had just come in the country, didn't understand the culture, and it went downhill from there. It all fell apart. Now we train, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the soldiers today, but we really try to instill a set of values in all of our soldiers, and they're good values. And we start in basic training. We take soldiers off the street from all walks of life and try to instill these values in them. So when we're on operations, we know we've got a soldier there that's got a pretty good set of values. Now they don't all stick. You've got good soldiers, you've got bad soldiers. But as a general rule, we try to instill these values in our soldiers today. And you can be very proud of your Army today. It is a great Army that has a great set of values. There are a few problems in there, but as a general rule, they're very good. This is a slide that was briefed in the Pentagon when I was there, but it just, we're looking at the future, and really the focus is the population growth, and where is that growth? And it's in the areas, the countries that can least afford it, the most economically deprived. And the wealthy countries, their population growth is on a rapid decline. And so in the future, if we don't get better understanding and get better connections around the world, we cannot become, an isolated country here. We've got to continue to reach out. We have so much. We've got to continue to engage around the world to try to keep the playing field a little level. Our goal needs to be keeping these young kids, great young kids out there, from becoming these young men. And if they do become these young men, how do we deal with them? And a lot of my associates think, this is our enemy. And so it's very, very fortunate to have panels like this. We need to continue to talk to each other, need to continue to open dialogues with people that really don't want to dialogue with you because they know what's right. And they've got their mindset done, but we've got to reach out to everyone and keep the dialogue going. When I retired, I started endowed chair at the University of Southern Mississippi, and just based on my lessons I learned in Baghdad and what I saw happen in New Orleans after Katrina. Our government doesn't do a real good job of handling natural disasters or even conflicts after we win the war. We're not as good at establishing the peace. And so the understanding, the dialogue, the conferences like this are just so important. I really applaud the Wheatley Institute for doing this and hope it continues. Thank you very much.
Every so often, somebody says something to you that just kind of changes the way you look at the world. And I want to give you 2 of those statements that hit me in my life. First one was when I was 17 years old and studying at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I went to a fireside, and it was given by the first counselor in the bishopric of the Ann Arbor ward. He was a convert to the church, and he was telling his conversion story. And his starting remark was, I realized that I really wanted to join the Mormon church when the bishop of the ward that I was attending as an investigator ran off with the Relief Society president. And that was such a new idea to me. I'd never thought of that before. And as a 17-year-old struggling to figure out where I fit in the world and what my beliefs were and how I related to the Mormon community, that gave me a lot to think about. Because his bottom line was, I can't relate to people who are perfect. But my takeaway from that was, boy, we're different. We're all different. We have very different ways of going about things and thinking about things. The second line that I want to share with you was one that I was told when a few years later, when I was doing some research in Morocco. I had gone down to the old city in Rabat to buy fruit. And I was standing next to this little old man with a fruit cart, and we were talking about stuff. And we were talking about a concept that the founders of the Arabic language put into Arabic in order to make sure that Americans could never pronounce it correctly. It's the concept of rizq. It's R-I-Z-Q, okay? And it means that it's the concept of God providing for mankind. And it's a phrase that's used all the time in Moroccan Arabic. And so we were talking about what this meant. And I was particularly interested because it related to the research that I was doing. And the fellow said, most people, when they say God will provide for you, they think God is literally going to take a hamburger or some turnips or these bananas, and he's going to hand them to you. He said, no. They've got it all wrong. They totally have it wrong. The rizq, God's provision for us is here. It's our mind. It's our brain. And what we do with it from then on is what is so incredibly important. Well, I was studying the issue of family planning, of birth control in Morocco. And my job at that time was to go search out Muslim religious leaders at the very highest levels, at middle levels, at the very lowest levels, and ask what they thought about family planning. In preparation for this research, I had spent the better part of a year at the University of Chicago, where I went to school, reading medieval jurisprudence texts. I had immersed myself in Islamic law to find out what the big thinkers of Islam essentially said about these issues. And the more I read, the more interested I became. Because there are many different schools of Islam. We talk a lot today about Sharia law, and we talked in the last session about Sharia law. But it's so important to understand that there is no one Sharia law. There is no one way of doing this. Just as there is no one authority in Islam that commands everyone else, that is the authority. There is no pope in Islam, so to speak. Many different interpretations of the basic sources of Islam, which make up Sharia law or Islamic law, have been developed by thinkers and jurists over the centuries. And these schools of jurisprudence have arisen to provide what each school thinks is an authoritative presentation or interpretation of the intent of the original texts. And the Quran is one of the texts. So when we use the term Sharia law in the United States, we're speaking as Westerners. We are not speaking as someone who really understands Islam, because just that term, Sharia law, doesn't make the distinctions between so many different interpretations. Now, in terms of family planning, some of these interpretations were very conservative. No family planning ever, okay? Others were very liberal, okay? Use family planning when it's needed. But the largest number of texts said something that struck me as being profound. They said, the husband and the wife are to consult together and determine what is the best option for their family. And as I read these texts, I realized that this idea of responsibility was vested in the very core and essence of Islam. My professor at the University of Chicago is Fazlur Rahman, who is he's having a renaissance now that he's dead. But he is a Pakistani thinker, educated in the religious seminaries in India, and then studied philosophy in Great Britain. But he truly had a way of looking at things. And his basic idea was to determine the principles that the Quran laid out, and then to work from there. But I want to read you what he said about an issue that ties to this responsibility principle. He talked in his book, Major Themes of the Quran, about the presence of Satan, that Satan, or what he called the anti-God principle, was a rebel, perpetually trying to seduce man and women away from the natural path, which is the straight path. The path that leads back to heaven and to what is good. Now, this has real implications for ideas of repentance and for ideas of the Day of Judgment, both two basic principles in Islam. But it also has a great deal to say about freedom of choice. And Professor Rahman went on to say, it is this deep-seated moral fact that constitutes the eternal challenge for man and renders his life an unceasing moral struggle. In this struggle, God is with man. Now, let me repeat that. In this struggle, God is with man, provided man makes the necessary effort. Man is squarely charged with this effort because he is unique in the order of creation, having been endowed with free choice. Now, what happens when we begin looking at the place of Muslims in the world today? There are different interpretations of Islam that deny that there is very much free choice open to man. And these come out of very strong medieval theological schools. There are others that insist that man's effort, that man's free choice, that man's determination to use his mind, so in order that God may bless him, may become a dominant thought. Now, as we look, we see so much publicity given to the most restrictive interpretations. These are dangerous interpretations. And these are interpretations that need to be understood, because these are the people we have to deal with in very different ways, okay, that we need to be able to talk and work with, or sometimes just confront. Okay? But we're also seeing within our country, a country that's supposed to be open to free expression of religion, misunderstandings, misconceptions that seem to be perpetually in the media, media figures with large audiences who make outrageous statements and are scarcely ever called by their audiences on what they say. Okay? Now, we're seeing a time of reform movements. We're seeing young Arabs and Muslims throughout the world engaging in politics in a way that they did not. When perestroika hit the Soviet Union, when Eastern Europe broke off and formed their own countries, the Middle East was silent. 20 years later, we see young Arabs and men and women of many other countries insisting on their right to the privileges that are accorded citizens of the United States, citizens of Canada, citizens of Western democracies. That brings up numerous questions. One of the questions is, how does the United States react to this? Who do we trust? How do we work our way through a thicket of Muslim opposition groups, Libyan opposition groups, Bahraini opposition groups in Yemen, in Syria? How do we know what will be best? And then the question is, in whose terms are, or would they be best? Well, every country is different. Every country has its own issues to deal with. It has its own challenges to face. When the United States became independent, we faced literally decades of working out our problems. We faced almost a decade of deciding we had to come up with a constitution and what that constitution would be. We then faced decades of rebellions, of protests, of questions as to how we formulate our jurisprudence and how we interpret our constitution. And those years were formative years. But then we moved into the greatest question of all, which is, what is a person? Can you be a slave in the United States of America? We faced the challenge of slavery, and with that we faced the question of whether this union would long endure, a challenge which cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Are we able to allow other countries to make the same decisions and to fight the same battles? In closing, I took the assignment seriously about giving advice on, or at least making an observation or two. I don't know how good I am at advice in terms of what to do in order to bring down the temperature in the United States in terms of Muslim relations. The first thing I think I do is go out and meet a Muslim. Just meet a Muslim, then maybe meet 2 or 3 of them, and just get to know them a little bit. Okay? Usually the people that are angriest about Muslims have never met any, don't know what they believe, what they do, how they live. Second, when you hear a bigoted statement, don't let it pass. I'll give you 2 phrases. We could even practice them here if we had time. Okay? The first phrase is, so why do you say that? Okay. The second phrase is a very simple phrase that I didn't learn till I was middle-aged, which is, I don't agree with you. Okay. Those phrases actually work fairly well. They work fairly well. Okay. Now, the other thing, the third thing that I would think about doing is whenever you hear a phrase with Muslim in it, try substituting your own religious group. When you hear Muslims, blah, 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 substitute Mormons, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And ask yourself, what if they were saying the same thing about you? Okay. If you put yourself in the phrase, I found it helps me think through some of the underlying assumptions as to what I say. Now, in conclusion, I just want to emphasize what a privilege it is to have Mr. Samrani Professor Matheson, Professor Nyang here with us. These are Muslims, Americans, in the avant-garde of taking on incredible challenges for what will be a new generation of Islam. Mormons believe, Professor Matson, Professor Nyang, you may not know, but Mormons believe that Joseph Smith, our prophet, had the gospel revealed to him in the United States for a purpose, and that there was a reason that Mormonism is situated, its founding is situated in the United States of America. Likewise, there may well be an important purpose that you are here working in this area today, because the United States of America and many of the other Western democracies, liberal democracies, offer opportunities that are unique in the history of the world. And they offer you a chance to be able to take a few steps back and ask, what is Islam, free from the constraints of states that dictate religious policy, that offer you the chance to determine what your religion means in an atmosphere where freedom of conscience is a given, where the Bill of Rights means something, where freedom of press, freedom of media, which we don't always like, but which we recognize the importance of, is a key principle. The Bill of Rights requires that we take on ourselves responsibility for being citizens, responsibility to act, responsibility to work within bounds. We're not very good at doing it, and it's probably important that the bounds are set very, very wide. But this is an area where the rights of individuals are stressed and where the rights of communities are minimized. Mormons find this troubling. We find this difficult to maneuver within. But we also believe it is important for us to determine who we are and what we believe. I wish you luck with the same process.
It's a privilege to be here, and I'd like to, first of all, thank the Wheatley Institution for sponsoring this. It's a wonderful opportunity to discuss things. I'm grateful for our guests who've come here to be with us. These are really, really important issues. A lot was said in the first panel about the ambiguity, the problems with the phrase Islam in the West. I found myself about a year and a half ago at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Melbourne, Australia, chairing a panel on Islam in the West, and I thought, I'm in Australia. What does that even mean? I mean, and then you think about the map. I mean, Morocco is to the west of Italy and Spain, or France anyway. So what is the West? What is Islam? We could go on about this for a long time. Human terms like this never quite make it. We're not talking geometry or symbolic logic here. You can't be quite so precise as you might like to be. So in a sense, there are really Wests and Islams, I suppose, that we're talking about. I just want to do a kind of whirlwind tour of a few things. I'll try to be short here so that we are brief so that we can allow time for questions and comments. In a sense, the West has always been negative toward Islam. This goes back to the first Arab conquests, which put the West, however we use that, the Christian world, something like that, on the defensive. And you see evidence of that in things like Muhammad's place in Dante's Inferno, where he's placed in one of the lowest areas of hell. This was a common medieval attitude toward Islam, reflected something of the Christian attitude toward Islam at the time, at least in the Latin West. In the Crusades, of course, Islam became the enemy. Deus vult, the Pope said. God wills it that we go to battle against the Muslim enemy. Although, oddly enough, one of the greatest of the commanders of the counter-crusade, Saladin or Saladin, actually did fairly well in Dante's Inferno. He's in the highest circle of hell, the best Dante could do for him. Put him in limbo. No suffering there, really, just kind of boring. The Ottomans, of course, were the infidel Turks, the great enemies, and always a threat to Eastern Europe, at the gates of Vienna a couple of times. And it even shows up in imaginative literature in the 20th century. You think of something like J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and the good guys are the people of the West, and the bad guys are the Easterners, and they wear turbans and things like that. So it's not hard to guess where they're coming from, really. Or even in the Chronicles of Narnia, the Calormenes wear turbans and have sort of darker complexions and so on. It's a recasting as myth of basically the Crusades. Islam was the other. It's a popular term right now, but really Islam was one of the original others in the way the West conceived itself and defined itself against something else. And it's already been mentioned here that when the West wanted to brand other things as other, they also they applied the label of Islam to them. It's been mentioned here that Mormonism was described as the Islam of America. Brigham Young had a harem and all that sort of thing. These terms were not chosen at random. I would argue that actually the reason that we've sometimes been at one another's throats or so often been in battle with one another has been precisely because we share territory. And I don't mean that only geographically. I mean that theologically and ideologically as well. You can't really fight unless you have some sort of shared area in which to fight, a place to have a battleground. And we have that theologically. Islam and Christianity and Judaism stake out claims to some of the same people. Moses, who is Moses? What does he mean? What is the significance of Abraham, and so on? So there was room for battle over that, and of course the shared political boundaries where we could fight, because the Islamic Christian frontier, whether in Anatolia or in Spain, was a place where we met and sometimes got along, more often sometimes than we realize, but often battled as well. Although the sides were constantly shifting. You'd see Christians fighting on the side of the Muslims. You look at the real story of El Cid, for example, in Spain. It's really a lot more ambiguous than a simple battle of Christianity versus Islam or anything like that. Likewise, the Crusades, to an extent, with the Crusader states in Palestine. But I wanted to talk about the West's attitude toward Islam, and really, as I say, there are Wests. There are different Wests. There is right now, for example, a predominantly secular West. In fact, an area in the West where religion is viewed as an overwhelmingly negative thing generally. There's embarrassment in elite circles, more so in Europe than in the United States, but embarrassment at the very idea of strongly held religious beliefs. It's somehow not right. The secularization thesis that was so popular for a long time predicted that eventually these religious ideas would all die out. As people became educated, as we became more prosperous, they would simply go away, but they haven't. Still, there's the notion among some more secularized Westerners that gee, if you meet someone who has really strong religious opinions, there's something wrong with that person. And this goes back a ways. I was just reading an essay a couple of nights ago by George Orwell, who found that he couldn't stand T.S. Eliot because Eliot was religious, and that obviously shows that he's mentally defective. It's essentially what he said. We have now the phenomenon of militant atheism in the West, the new atheists, as they're called. And they often use Islam as a symbol. It's their chosen target. Sam Harris has been so fierce on this as to, I think, more than halfway hint at the idea of a battle against Islam simply as Islam, just to get rid of these people who believe such things. I've felt uncomfortable about Christopher Hitchens, whose support for the war in Iraq. You can debate that one back and forth, but Hitchens seems to like the war in Iraq, or seems to have liked it because it was against religious people. Otherwise, he's a Trotskyite, so it's hard to know why he would be suddenly taking this seemingly right-wing or neoconservative position. You have people who are sort of on the frontier of a religious anti-Islamic feeling in the West. I don't know if they're really doing it for religious reasons or not. One is Robert Spencer. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's the author of a number of books on a biography of Muhammad, a book called, that I'm really fond of, the Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, in which he repeats as his dedication, Deus Vult, God wills it. The slogan of the Pope for the Crusades, which I don't know about you, but that makes me extremely uncomfortable. And Osama bin Laden thinks that the West is at war with Islam. Well, so here comes Robert Spencer to say, yeah, that's true. Thanks. It's a really big help. I've debated Robert Spencer a couple of times. The last time was in... some people dream of teaching, I suppose, at Cambridge or Oxford or whatever. I've reached the pinnacle of my academic aspirations. I debated Robert Spencer at Bally's Resort Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Before an audience of about, I'm told it was about 800 or so, and the lights were in my face, and it was black and so on. All I knew was that I was not before a friendly audience. Every once in a while someone would yell out from the crowd, "You're an idiot," while I was speaking. It felt great to be there. I found out afterwards that what I was talking to was a convention of libertarians. They were all followers of Ayn Rand, hate religion in general and Islam specifically. So that's one brand of thing that we run into now. There's also, dare I mention him here, Glenn Beck, Brother Beck. Now you have to understand that I am politically fairly Neanderthal. Donnelly will endorse that. But I listened to Glenn Beck on Islam, and I get really uncomfortable. The other day, I just caught about 3 minutes of it while I was putting on my shoes, and he was talking about the term Al-Quds, used for Jerusalem. And he explained that Muslims use that term today because they're trying to erase Israel from the map. And I thought, that's amazing, the gift of prophecy among medieval Muslims who used that term centuries and centuries ago. They didn't even know there would be an Israel, but they were using. Actually, it's flattery to Jerusalem in a way to call it Al-Quds, the holy place. It's a reference to the temple and the heritage of the prophets there. But one of the things I point out here is simply that we're dealing with a lot of misinformation. And there are a lot of really prominent voices out there saying things that aren't true about Islam. And it sometimes makes me very depressed when I think, how in the world can we possibly keep up with this? We have assertive conservative Christianity. Now, in some ways, I'm sympathetic to it, but I'd have to say there are elements of it that I'm not sympathetic to. And the audience here will appreciate that the same people that write militantly anti-Mormon books have now found that there's more money to be made in writing militantly anti-Muslim books. And they use the same high standards of evidence and reasoning that they used in those other first books. So there was one in particular, I remember he had written a book in which he claimed that he had read every book in the Library of Congress on Mormonism before writing it, and someone asked me about it, and I said it was absurd. It wasn't possible. Well, apparently this person passed my comment on to him. I got a letter from him in my mailbox. I was surprised it didn't melt the mailbox. He was so angry. And he said that he always reads every book in the Library of Congress on every subject before he writes. And here's his new book on Islam is just coming out, and he read every book in the Library of Congress on Islam. Now, I'm sorry, I don't believe it. That's putting it mildly. Well, I am concerned. I know I promised that I'd be short, but I haven't done a very good job at it. I'll try. I have been disturbed, actually, recently by what I see as a rise of anti-Islamic sentiment in the United States. And this is anecdotal. I can't prove it. But when right after 9/11, for example, I began giving lectures here in what's called Education Week at BYU, where we get, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people on campus. And I would get, for my lectures on Islam, and they were lectures on the Quran, on the life of Muhammad and so on, I would get 1,500 people in a lecture hall for that. Pretty amazing. People wanted to understand. And they were very, very sympathetic. They wanted to feel good about Islam. They wanted to be reassured that Muslims were not so terribly foreign as they had thought. But I've noticed as I give these presentations, and not just here, but across the United States and actually in Europe, in Frankfurt last weekend, there are more and more people who come up to me and say, well, but what about this? What about that? They're hostile. They're confrontational. There's one fellow who comes to my lectures almost all the time. I hope he's not here. Actually, maybe I shouldn't say this. But he always comes up and he waits for the question and answer session to end, and he's just shaking with rage. And the last time I told him, look, you just shouldn't come to my lectures anymore. I'm worried about you. You're going to have a heart attack. At Education Week, surely there's some sort of presentation on, I don't know, basket weaving or homemaking or cooking muffins or something that you could attend. But this troubles me, and it's why I think programs like this are so important, that we need to respond to that. Because, the books by scholars on Islam sell reasonably well. But I'll tell you what sells better. It's the books in the spiritual counterfeits section in Christian bookstores in many cases. They come under the radar of the New York Times bestseller list. They're selling more. You want to know what people out there are really reading? They're reading a lot of those books, and they are not written by John Esposito. They're not written by reputable Islamic scholars. They're written by people who don't know anything at all, but are deeply, deeply hostile and not very careful, again, to put it very mildly. Now, I don't say it's all one-sided. I'm not going to blame the West. I'll say there are real problems in the Islamic community today. There are areas of the Islamic world that are profoundly dysfunctional, and that's a problem Muslims are going to have to deal with. And I hope that we can help them, we in the West, but we can't help them too much because we don't want to be seen as co-opting them in any way. So it's a dangerous little dance. Don't know exactly how to do it. I'm almost done. I lost count of when I started, so... 1 minute. Okay. I've got 15 points to make. It's 4 seconds each. Let me tell you a quick story. I was invited. You'll just have to drag me away. Well, it was 2 years ago, I think. I was invited down to Orlando, Florida. A woman down there had given money to the project that I head up, which is this Islamic translation series that we do. And I asked her, what can I do for you as a token of thanks? And she said, well, I'd love you to come down. She was a Latter-day Saint, a Mormon. Come and speak in my church about Islam. Her late husband had been from Lebanon, actually a Christian, but she was very partial to the Middle East. So I came down, and somebody there got the bright idea of inviting the imam from the local mosque in Orlando to come to the service, or to the fireside. And when he came, he brought 50 members of his congregation, and I thought, hey, this is great. I had him come up and sit on the stand. During the question and answer session, when people were asking questions, what do Muslims believe about this? What do they say about that? I thought, it's pretty ridiculous to be asking me. We've got the imam here. Let's have him come up and speak. He did. He answered a lot of the questions, and we had a great time. And so a few months later, I was really surprised, though, when I got an email from him asking if I would come down. They had an annual conference on the Prophet Muhammad. Would I be willing to come down and be the keynote speaker? And I thought, now that is so weird. Absolutely yes. And so we had a great time with that, too. I understand afterwards he caught real flack for that, but he told people, wait until after he's spoken. It'll be okay. And it turns out the LDS leader had gotten flack the previous few months for having me come and speak on Islam and having the imam on the stand in our church. That's about where I want to be, catching flack from both sides. But the thing I'm really pleased with, and we were asked for recommendations. Here's mine. I had others, but I won't give them. The recommendation is simply this. It's one thing to go in and do a dialogue and have a speech. But what I really like is that the two communities there said, hey, let's work together on humanitarian things. It turns out there's something like, I think the figure was 85 Pakistani doctors in that Orlando mosque. Well, they were looking for things they could do in the community. Well, the Mormons do a lot of humanitarian stuff, and we're pretty good at organizing things. We can work together, and my understanding is that they are. Now, that delights me. I can come in and speak, and 2 minutes later, people may say, oh, that was interesting. What did he say? Can't remember. But if they will work together side by side, they'll get to know each other. And this is Islam and the West meeting together in Orlando, Florida, because we're all there together. Well, I just want to say that to me that's the important thing. I love talking to each other, but I think working side by side, learning to value one another as human beings is the most important thing we can do. And there's lots of opportunity for that.
Thank you very much. I think this has been extraordinary. We do have a shorter time period for question and answer. I'd like to open it, but as people make their way to the microphone, let me share an experience. When we lived in Saudi Arabia, Stephen Covey came to give a talk on the 7 principles of effective leadership, and He went right into the belly of the beast, speaking in a huge ballroom. And there were, you could simply tell by the dress, the overwhelming majority of the people who were there were Saudi businessmen. And at one point in the presentation, and I thought it was extraordinarily courageous, he said, "You know, I stand here in the midst of the homeland of Islam and think about the strength of the religious tradition in this country. And when you think about the strength of that foundation, about the strength of that tradition, you know, this should be the most open society on earth." And he just let the comment hang there in the air for a moment. Now let me hold up a mirror. The strength of the religious tradition in this room, the sense of security about who we are in God's eyes, how we feel about our faith, should make us open in just the ways these three panelists have talked about. Open to think about service projects we can do together, open to understand what it means when a general with great leadership skills, good understanding of the Middle East was able to make such a difference in ways that A, preserved lives of American soldiers, and B, built bridges. And then Professor Bowen's very, very personal and heartfelt comments. So I just would leave that open before you, that rather than grab our mantle of faith and wrap it tightly around us, I really sense, as Stephen Covey was trying to tell in Riyadh, why don't I say it here in Provo, that to be open and to insist when you hear something about Islam, just have the integrity to make sure it's accurate, to ask the question, is that really true? Or if you don't agree, to say you don't agree. It's not an earth-ending event to disagree with someone. But these simple gestures, which are consistent with who we are, I think are the beginning to making some real difference. Apologize, but it really did, it brought back that memory of Riyadh. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions and answers, and would like to ask people as they go to the mic, which is located over here under this very bright light. Please do take a minute to identify yourself as you ask your question.
Brett, I've got a question.
Okay, General Blunt.
No, I just, with the recent Quran burning and the reaction in Afghanistan to that, it really troubles me, and I have been asked about it. How I would ask our other panel reps, how would they respond to that? And is it a justified response? And as a Christian talking to brothers, how can we explain that? I think I understand, but I would like to hear it from some of our other scholars.
So we thought this burning was going to happen earlier, and when we thought it was going to happen in America, we had a press conference in Washington the first week of September during Ramadan about this. There must have been 50 major religious leaders, American religious leaders, who spoke about this, and spoke about this from their own empathy and love for their Muslim neighbors, and stated very clearly that this person who was doing it was not acting in the name of Christianity or in the name of America. And I felt it was my responsibility as a Muslim, and I said it on that day, and we were interviewed on Al Jazeera and other networks, Arab networks and networks in the Muslim world, that it was not acceptable for any Muslim to hold all of America or all of Christianity accountable for the actions of this one person, any more than it's fair for me as a Muslim to be held accountable for what a terrorist or criminal Muslim does. And so, of course, what he did is it's painful, it's hurtful, it's ignorant. I think it's unchristian. I'm not a Christian, but I think I could say it's unchristian. But the response is clearly criminal. I mean, they committed murder. It is no defense of the Quran to kill someone. To defend the Quran is to live by the Quran. And like I said that day, the Quran can never be destroyed by burning. The Quran is in the hearts of millions of Muslims across the world. It's not going to be destroyed. Even if all the books were gathered and burned, it wouldn't be destroyed. It's memorized. In terms of priorities, those lives are so valuable, and the people who killed them, they have no excuse. There's absolutely no excuse, and they should be found and prosecuted for murder. And I don't think anyone should have any hesitation about that. Any non-Muslim should not have any hesitation about that. There's wrong and there's wrong. Both things were wrong, but one was murder. And that's worse.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
What was the most important thing for you to understand about Islamic culture that fostered good relations with the people in Baghdad, or in the areas that you were in?
Well, one of the most important things, and we dealt with this with all of the new soldiers coming in, especially ones that weren't with us during the initial attack, is that every Muslim's not a terrorist. And in reality, that's the mindset that a lot of, I'd say the majority of our soldiers had when they deployed and came into country. And we saw it in Saudi Arabia, Fred, with all the security teams that come through to protect us. Their mindset is that every Arab's a potential terrorist, and so getting that over that with our own soldiers was one of our biggest challenges, and getting them to feel comfortable talking. And like you said, go meet a Muslim. And, you have to reach out and get that dialogue going.
My name is Craig Rossell. I was intrigued by a comment from Professor Bowen. She mentioned slavery, U.S. slavery, and how it was worked out within that country, and a comment that was left completely open by Professor Peterson about some dysfunctional elements of Islamic society. To me, that sounds like a symposium all by itself. What are they, and where are they located? But to try to ask a question that weaves those two threads together, are there any dysfunctional elements of Islamic society that are not amenable to self-determination? Are there any of those elements that countries or peoples outside the region should feel threatened by enough to where some kind of constructive activity would be warranted?
The politics of the Middle East are complicated, very complicated, and they have roots that go far back in time. And the states are all very, very different. I think you're all getting a sense of that as you watch the news and pay attention to what's going on country by country, as there have been reform movements. Governments that refuse to accord their people respect or rights are dysfunctional, and they refuse to allow their people to have self-determination. Now, I think it's a real stretch to say that this comes from Islam, because when I grew up, the greatest presence, political presence, an enemy of the United States was the Soviet Union. They were not Muslims. We fought wars that the First and Second World War that were extremely serious. The greatest number of casualties the United States has ever lost was in fighting not against the Nazis or European powers, but in fighting against our own people. Mankind is prone to bloody conflict. The place of religion in this, in my sense, usually plays a second or third or fourth place to the religious traditions. Now, that said, there are radical interpretations of Islam that, in my mind, need to be confronted. And they need to be confronted within the Muslim community first, within the countries in which these groups arise first, and then following that by others in the world that care for the values that politically developed nations espouse.
If the question is, do I want to name specifically dysfunctional areas? Well, geographically, there are obviously some. Afghanistan under the Taliban was a dysfunctional place. It was a terrible place, just in every regard. Oppressive to women, oppressive to everybody. Are there places that call for Western intervention? They might be. The fact is, the world is small right now, and sometimes dysfunctional areas become threats to other areas. And if they do, then sometimes, I'm not laying out any specific political position here, but sometimes it will be necessary for other areas to deal with a threat that's... Here I am. I seem to be endorsing preemptive strikes. I don't even want to be that specific. Just say sometimes you have to deal with things that are going on. I'm trying to be very unpolitical here today. I'll talk with Donnelly later. But I think we have to be frank about that. I get really irritated in conversations where I hear people going on and on and on against Islam, but I also get equally irritated when I'm with people who want to paint the whole thing as just ideal and it's purely a Western problem. There are problems on both sides. And the West has not always understood the Islamic world properly, and some of the grievances that people in the Islamic world have against the West are legitimate. The fact is, our talk about democracy and so on rings hollow in much of the Islamic world, because during the Cold War, we often supported or made common cause with regimes that were not democratic at all and were oppressive to their people. Now, to be honest, I'm not quite sure during the Cold War that we had many options. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's line when someone asked him, well, what about Hitler's invasion of Russia? You hate the communists, and here you are backing aid to Stalin. He said, look, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd put in a good word for the devil. So we sometimes have had to make common cause with people because that's the world of real politics. But on the other hand, I can't blame people who see that and afterwards conclude, gosh, you guys aren't really serious about democracy. You didn't seem to care about it when it affected us. So the fact is there have been mistakes made on the Western side, but also there are serious problems in the Islamic world. And I don't like to see either side blamed as solely responsible for the problems. But I do think the West does play a role. The fact is, like it or not, we have enormous influence in the Islamic world. The United States is the bull in the china shop. We can't do anything without having an impact just about everywhere. We have to, though, try to be conscious about what it is we're doing and make sure that it's the effect we want to have and not some effect that's going to come back and do us great damage. And that's happened all too often. And part of the problem is, simply, and this is an appeal for all of you to come and study Islam and world affairs and all those sorts of things, is that we don't know very much. I mean, the United States is a huge country, and we just don't know much about the world, and they're watching our news, we're not watching theirs. And so we make terrible mistakes, because we, even with the best will in the world, good intentions, we don't know what we're doing quite often.
Thank you very much. All right, perhaps this might be the last question. We'll move to a wrap-up session. Please go ahead.
My name's Garrett Wilcox. I'm a student here at BYU. My question is, when we talk about the anti-Islamic sentiment here in the United States and in the West, how accurate is that? I mean, with Indonesia being the most populous Islamic country in the world, I've never ever heard anyone say, I hate Indonesians because they're Muslim. But, I mean, would a better term be there's a strong anti-Arabic or Central Asian sentiment within the United States that's been mixed up with anti-Islamic label, or is really the West perspective of Islam, does it go to all Islamic peoples?
I think a lot of Americans wouldn't even know that Indonesia was Muslim. That's just the way it is. So, or that Iranians are not Arabs, or that Turks are not Arabs, and we're often not well enough informed to make those not very subtle distinctions. And so that's part of the problem. But No, I think there's a general fear and mistrust of Muslims among a lot of Americans right now. It's just a real concern that all Muslims are terrorists or sympathetic to terrorists. Now, people who've actually known them, they've lived in Indonesia, for example, they know better than that. But it's often a problem of ignorance.
All right, one more. Please.
I'm Erin White. Those are actually two of my professors on the board because I just graduated with my BA in December in Middle Eastern Studies.
Congratulations, Erin.
Thank you. I was happy to get my diploma. I was.
I tried to stop it.
You just wanted to keep me around to help with your text initiative. Yeah. Speaking of your text initiative, by the way, Mr. Axelgaard mentioned that at the beginning and wondering if there was any positive impact from that. I was wondering if there was. And I know you went to Saudi Arabia in the middle of our 425 class. I was wondering if we were actually going to do that project with the Saudis. Do you know about that?
Oh, I know a lot about that.
I thought you might, you and Dr. Green.
Yeah, we currently have a couple of people there serving in Saudi Arabia who are helping to digitize the records of the late King Faisal of Saudi Arabia as a service project. And so, yes, that's gone forward. And there have been really positive outcomes, impacts of this project. We've got friends in places we've never had them before, and so I'm very grateful for that. Let me tell a really, really quick story about 9/11. People laugh because they know my stories aren't quick, but this one is. I remember 9/11, that morning. I was getting ready to come up to campus. It was a little bit late, and my wife said, "You need to come out here and see this." And we saw that the first tower had just been hit. At that point, we still thought, maybe it's just a plane that went wrong. While we were watching, the second tower was hit, and that made it obvious this is some sort of deliberate attack. And I remember thinking immediately, I thought, this is Osama bin Laden. That's who it is. This has all the earmarks. I know who it is. And I thought, good grief, I just sort of launched, we hadn't been going too long on this little project of the translation series, which was partly designed to create better relations between the Islamic world and the West. And I thought, what's the point of a project like this against something like that? We can't do anything. This just overwhelms us. And then, and I won't say it was a voice, but really strongly, right back to me came this inner voice that said, it's more important now than it ever was. And so, take that however you will, but it was really strong and distinct to me, and I thought, okay, all right, can't be defeated by this, we have to go forward. But, so anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I know there might be other questions to ask. I think I can guarantee that the panelists will stick around, especially to speak with students for a few more minutes. Let me now ask Doug Johnson to come up, and he'll offer a brief interpretive summary from his side, and I'll add a thought after that.
Well, it's been a rich feast today, and it's a bit like sipping from a fire hydrant. There's so many good ideas flowing around. But our task now, within the next few minutes, is to just see what we can suggest by a first step toward a way ahead. And as a reminder, the challenge that we set for ourselves at the outset was to try to listen through the other's ears to what we ourselves are saying. That's not just listening to what they say, but try to understand how they're understanding us. It's a tall order, to be sure, and it will undoubtedly take a while before we get there. The second challenge was to take this first step in charting a way ahead that builds on the strengths of our respective cultures. Based on the presentations and ensuing dialogue of both panels, I would offer the following. As some of the panelists suggested, particularly Dr. Nyang and Dr. Mattson, we should probably rethink our characterization of Islam in the West. Islam and the rest is probably too broad, but Islam and secularization may be closer to what's needed. Even here, though, one has to understand what is meant by secularization. When we say secular in the West, many Muslims hear godless, when what was intended was freedom to worship as you please. And as Dr. Peterson, I think, implied, the reason for this misunderstanding finds its roots in history And it has to do with the fact that the American Revolution took place before the French Revolution. As you trace the history of England through the Magna Carta, the beheading of Charles I and all, when you got to the age of the forefathers, religion was still intact. And they brought that with them when they came over here. So they leaned heavily on their religion as they launched this American experiment. Not too long afterwards, the French Revolution took place. I think it was 1789. And that was a very different exercise, because there the protest was against the divine right of kings. The Catholic Church was seen to be very complicit in the whole problem. So rather than taking an Edmund Burke approach of preserving what has gone before, the wisdom of the ages, and then reforming on the margins, they took a Jean-Jacques Rousseau approach, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They actively purged religion to make way for secular humanism. So you get very different responses between Europeans and Americans in terms of what's meant by secular. So again, as I think Professor Nyang was so eloquently put it, trying to find a common denominator for the West is a real challenge in and of itself. And I do remember an instance about 3 years ago when we invited 6 high-level folks from Sudan and Kashmir to the National Prayer Breakfast. And after going through the several days surrounding those activities, 5 of those folks were Muslims. And to a person, they all said how incredibly surprised they were to learn how strongly our democratic process rested on our religious faith. And they said they felt much closer as a result. Now, as Mr. Samnani suggested, it's a mistake to judge all Muslims based on the behavior of the extremists. To quote Oliver Wendell Holmes, "How do you understand if you can't differentiate? How can you differentiate if you don't understand?" Thus, it is critically important to disaggregate the challenge. I'm sure that General Blount and what he has been talking about, you need to disaggregate the enemy so that you can deal with it accordingly. If we fail to disaggregate, we could unwittingly alienate the entire Muslim population around the world. And after disaggregating, we should develop a strategy for each subcategory, empowering the mainstream while marginalizing or eliminating the extremists. There was also some concern following the first panel, with a few in the audience feeling that the panelists had not actually responded to the intent behind the questions relating to Muslim realities overseas, ranging from the mistreatment of women to the hudud punishments of Sharia, which call for amputation of limbs and the like. As was suggested in the response to those questions, much of what people were concerned about could more properly be attributed to tribalism than religion. But that's not the entire answer. And I think to facilitate a better understanding of these and other important questions like that, I think we need to become more proactive in reaching out. This was implicit in a lot of the discussion that was taking place here. And here I would turn to religious leaders as one of the more effective ways ahead. I submit that I think each one of us should go to, the leader of our church, our synagogue, our temple, our mosque, and prevail upon our church leader to try to reach out to, let's just take a church, for example, and reach out to the nearest mosque to try to establish a relationship with the imam in that mosque. And this has been done on a number of occasions, and it's worked beautifully. I think even one example was suggested during the question and answer period, where you then come together, socialize, actually visit one another's religious institutions. These often end with the imam giving a sermon in the church and the pastor giving a sermon in the mosque. And once that starts to happen and people get to interact with one another and relate with one another, lots of good things come out of that. We have done that in Pakistan. We've conducted interfaith seminars where we brought preachers together with imams for a 3-day experience, very, close, highly personal experience where they discuss with one another the problems they're having. And as you well know, a lot of Christian organizations, Christians themselves, are having problems in Pakistan and other Muslim majority countries. And out of these, they always come up with an action agenda where they jointly commit to moving forward on those agendas, and they do. And on the Muslim side, this often means going into the more radical areas, the Muslims going in there and sitting down with the imams and talking about the benefits of religious cooperation and what have you. And you'd be amazed. It sounds like it wouldn't have a chance of going anywhere, but it does go places. So you just have to make the effort. As Professor Bowen commented, I think that surveys show that a far greater proportion of Americans have favorable views of Muslims who actually know one than those who do not. So that's another benefit. Here I think the Mormons have a special role to play, as Fred Axelgard has suggested, especially in the arena of family values, to which Mormons and Muslims alike are very strongly committed. So in summary, as a first step toward finding a way ahead, I think our panelists are suggesting, one, that we rethink our categories. Islam in the West really doesn't do so well. Two, that we disaggregate the threat and strategize accordingly. And three, that we become more proactive in reaching out. Thank you again for the privilege of being with you today, and turn it over to you, Fred, for any additional comments.
Let me just repeat again the thanks to the Wheatley Institution for providing this opportunity. And again, I'd like to extend a personal thanks to each one of the panelists that joined on my panel this afternoon. I have three quick thoughts to offer. First, the word propane. Just think about what it took for General Blunt and his team to realize that propane was the fuel behind a lot of the animosity and the hostility they were encountering. What would it take for you to find out what's the propane that's being carried around in the backpack, figuratively speaking, of Muslims in our community or in the world? I spent some time this morning with some high school students down in Mount Pleasant, Utah, and had a question about the Palestinian issue. And I don't have any answers for the Palestinian issue, but I think I understand some of the challenges. I understand that Hamas on Gaza and the Palestinian National Authority in the West Bank do not have a common voice, and that makes it hard to find somebody to negotiate with. But it struck me afterward that what really was important was that I listened, that I reflected some interest and some compassion and some understanding. And I think figuring out what the propane is involves listening. The second thought, education. I was in the Middle East when all of the things in Tunisia and Cairo were unfolding. It was a fascinating moment to be there. And there was an article written from Beirut by a very smart and well-known Jordanian journalist who said, "Where is the United States? The U.S. is irrelevant to what's going on." And what he meant was the U.S. government. And I said, you know, that's worth thinking about. But then I noticed his byline. He was writing from the American University of Beirut, the American University of Beirut. And I started thinking about AUB. I served a mission in Lebanon. I was the last missionary to get out before the Civil War ended that work. And AUB has been chugging along like a nuclear reactor since the mid-1860s, churning out graduates, spilling out into the Arab world. And as recently as 6 months ago, a wonderful businessman in Dubai said, "I still look to AUB for the engineers I need." And then I thought American University of Cairo, American University of Kuwait, American University of Sharjah. And then I thought about 45,000 Saudi students in the United States right now. I thought about the school down in Mount Pleasant. It may be an exaggeration, but what is going on in the Middle East, in no small part, stems from some of the seeds that have been sown in the educational efforts taking decades and decades and decades to take root. Whatever we think we might have achieved through military intervention, with all due respect, General, economic support, the impact of who we are, what we have that is good and thoughtful and lasting, that has been provided through the means of education coming out of the United States education system outweighs it all, in my humble opinion. And again, to salute BYU and the Wheatley Institution for digging these roots even a little deeper. One last thought, just how warm it can feel sometimes to identify with somebody, quote, on the other side. As an employee of the American Embassy in Riyadh, periodically I'd go into the to the Ministry of Defense and have meetings with Saudi generals. And it's surprising how often you got distracted off onto the subject of religion. And I remember vividly one day sitting in the office of a Saudi general, and somehow we got off onto the topic of religion, and he went off talking about going to the mosque that morning for early morning prayers. Would have been about 4:45, long before seminary students are up and about, at least out in the area where we have early morning seminary. But he was glowing with pride, with joy, with all of those feelings that a parent expresses, with the love and anticipation of his own sons following in his footsteps. It was really good to be there. I feel there is a resonance in the intensity of which that man feels about his son, the way I feel about my children and my expectations. I guess you had to be there, and maybe that's the point. Meet somebody, make a difference, offer a listening ear, and we'll find those ways to get the propane needed to where it should go. I turn the time back over now to Richard, and again, thank you.
Thank you for your attendance. I think we've been richly blessed, I'll use the word. And it's almost as if we handpicked the people to participate in this symposium, which of course we did. And I want to thank each of them for being willing to come and participate and share with us, and each of you for your kind attention and your participation on behalf of the Wheatley Institution, the Kennedy Center, and all who've had a part in it. We want to thank Brother Jack Wheatley for making this possible and having the vision to bring about events like this and to pursue the common good that we all care so much about.